CBS News has confirmed Attorney General Bill Barr is encouraging U.S. attorneys nationwide to seek federal charges against violent protesters, even when state charges could apply. The Wall Street Journal was the first to break this story. In a call last week, Barr reportedly suggested federal prosecutors consider charging demonstrators with sedition, a rarely used law that is only levied when someone is suspected of attempting to overthrow the government. Barr also warned the violence could escalate as we get closer to the election. Aruna Viswanatha co-wrote that article and joins us now. She's a reporter with the Wall Street Journal covering the Justice Department. Aruna, I hope I got your name right. Thanks for joining us. This is an incredible report. You know, the Attorney General in comments that he made yesterday wasn't even accurate in the number of African Americans, Black people killed by police. He gave a wildly the number that he came up with, which doesn't appear to be based on any fact or research, was wildly off the mark. So he's now talking about sedition cases. Explain what that would look like and tell us what the Attorney General is trying to achieve.
Sure, thanks for having me. So sedition is this law that's on the books that does make it a crime to conspire with somebody else to overthrow the government. And it has been very rarely used. The Attorney General is clearly very interested in pursuing more cases against some of the violence that has accompanied these mass demonstrations across the country. And because this law has been so rarely used, it did raise some eyebrows amongst prosecutors about what such a case would really look like. In one of the few cases in recent years to invoke this statute, prosecutors in Michigan had filed charges against members of this militia in 2010, where these members of a militia were accused of plotting to kill a local police officer as part of this sort of plan to start an armed clash with state and federal authorities. And ultimately, that case ended in an acquittal when these defendants basically argued that, the case was really circumstantial. They didn't actually plan to carry out the things that they had talked about. And so we could potentially see some cases being brought along those same lines. And, it's possible they run into the same kinds of problems this case had in the past.
Of course, when I heard that, I thought, well, how exactly is that defined? Is it defined in a very clear way, or is this sort of a catch-all that runs the risk of trampling on First Amendment rights?
It's a real gray area because it's been so rarely used. Courts haven't sort of very explicitly defined what this would look like. And I think our sense is that if a prosecution were to be successful, it has to basically be folks who are on the way to commit this act of violence that they had explicitly planned, and they were preparing to kill government agents, government officials. In one of the few successful times this was used was back in the 90s. If you remember the blind sheik that was convicted of a plot to blow up the World Trade Center. In that case, he was convicted of a seditious conspiracy. But it has to be something that imminent and that big and potentially destructive to, I think, ultimately be successful. Where you do end up with these First Amendment concerns is, it's obviously not illegal to talk about being against the government or being critical of the government. It's not even illegal to talk about potentially violent acts against government officials. What is illegal is carrying out almost pursuing all the things that would lead you to actually carry out those violent acts. So there's this really fine line between what's just protected speech and talk and what is actually violent action.
Yeah, and of course, law enforcement could arrest someone for conspiracy if that was something that they were planning to actually do. But to go back to your initial reporting, I mean, given that some of the destruction that we saw from people who were not peacefully demonstrating, as is their First Amendment right, there have been so few arrests of those individuals. What it sounded like to me was that there was sort of this like blanket, BLM. We're going to go after BLM and we're going to use
or Antifa.
Or Antifa, yes, thank you, Anne-Marie, which nobody knows who that is, what that means. It's sort of nebulous, and of course the concern could be that somebody who happens to be in the vicinity of a location where, you know, somebody has, you know, burned a place of business or, you know, building or car or whatever it is, could get wrapped up in an investigation or sort of a dragnet. And I guess that's the concern. I mean, it seems as if Barr is equating every demonstrator, everybody who is protesting, you know, equal treatment under the law, wants equal treatment under the law, wants police brutality against black people to end. He's sort of lumping them in to BLM, which is sort of, you know, oftentimes used as a word to trigger people, same way that Antifa is.
Right. So they have brought cases specifically involving arson, say when you do have some of these cars being burned and buildings being burned at these otherwise peaceful protests. But clearly the Attorney General is pushing prosecutors to go further. And yes, the concern is that these cases do encroach more into that gray area of protected speech. They are also considering using this law that allows them to arrest people who impede a law enforcement officer responding to unrest. And what exactly does that mean? Does that mean, you know, you're filming an officer trying to respond to arrest? Is that impeding them? You're getting in their way. You're holding a protest sign in their way. Does that count? And that is clearly the concern, that the cases that have been more specifically targeted on the after these violent acts have occurred, charging those people, will the cases move beyond that into these gray areas that we're talking about? And yes, the Attorney General has specifically blamed a lot of this violence on Antifa and sort of described them as like an organized revolutionary movement. And so clearly that is what he's thinking about as he's pushing for more cases. Whether we actually see cases like that materialize is another question, but that's clearly on his mind as he's pushing for these cases.
Aruna, I want to ask you about some of the Attorney General's comments that he made last night at a conservative forum. He spoke on several topics, including Black Lives Matter. Let's listen to what he had to say.
These so-called Black Lives Matter people, now that as a proposition, who can quarrel with the proposition Black Lives Matter? But they're not interested in Black lives. They're interested in props. A small number of blacks who were killed by police during conflict with police, usually less than a dozen a year, who they can use as props to achieve a much broader political agenda. But I view the question of Black lives as not only keeping people alive, but also having prosperity and flourishing in their communities.
So Barr has made that claim before, that a small number of Black Americans are being killed by police during a conflict. But data from the Washington Post shows that police are killing blacks at more than twice the rate of whites in the U.S. And I should point out that, you know, there are many, many injustices that come before one is killed in a police conflict. Many ways in which your rights can be trampled on that don't have to result in death. But what do these comments tell us about the Attorney General and his thought process?
He definitely has this very defined worldview and has been wading sort of more and more into these politically sensitive questions, I think, as the election approaches. And he's been talking about how he thinks there's going to be more violence. He's describing groups like Black Lives Matter, like Antifa, as being very sort of fringe or radical in some sense, and driven by political goals, which, you know, may not completely comport with, you know, what else we're seeing these groups doing. And so he's clearly sort of wading into this arena with very specific, you know, political views.
Yeah, I think that's probably a pretty good conclusion. Aruna Viswanatha, thank you so much.
Thank you.